Previously on Reconnect America.
There was this new technology. Nobody could compete in American life without having access to this infrastructure.
What would get a railroad into trouble more quickly than anything else when it came to filing rates is if that rate placed one class of shippers or one set of communities at a comparative disadvantage relative to another.
This system was in place during the Great American Takeoff that created the world's largest middle class, incredible industrial base that won World War II.
It was never set up to protect the railroads and other forms of transportation.
The interstate highway system was draining freight traffic from the railroads at government expense.
The railroads continued to be strenuously regulated as common carriers.
People like Alfred Kahn are coming and emphasizing the economic benefits of deregulation. And people in the Carter administration are saying, if we can do it for airlines and it seems to be working, why can't we do it for railroads? And by the way, this may be the only way to save Conrail.
One of the big focuses post-deregulation was a shift from public accountability focus to one where revenue adequacy was the primary goal for the railroads.
Post-Staggers, the class ones were absolutely focused on reducing costs. They were acting more like a business instead of like a utility. And as you know, there were a lot of negatives to that.
In the 10 years from 1970 to 1980, America's relationship to its railroads underwent a profound reorientation of purpose, a paradigm shift that, if we examine carefully, helps us understand and interpret the circumstances we find ourselves in today. From the very beginning, the U.S. had pursued a peculiar approach to its railroads, privileging private corporations with the opportunity to build, maintain, and operate this critical national infrastructure. For almost a century, this privilege was paired with a responsibility to steward the public interest. And through an intricate regulatory system, private railroads were treated as quasi-public utilities. They were designated as common carriers, and as such, they had an obligation to provide reasonable service upon reasonable request. Standard non-discriminatory rates protected shippers from monopoly abuse and protected railroads from destroying each other with what is referred to as ruinous competition. This ensured that railroads had adequate revenues and that communities had affordable and reliable access to rail transportation. And that worked for a while. But as we learned in earlier episodes, public investment in competing modes of transportation gradually undermined this balance, pushing U.S. railroads to the brink of collapse. To some, public ownership of either the tracks or the whole system seemed an obvious solution to this crisis. But instead, the U.S. went to extraordinary lengths to rescue railroad corporations and keep the infrastructure they operated under private control. In the 1960s, regulators who had given up on previous mandates to design a sustainable system plan permitted a wave of haphazard mergers. Those mergers eroded competition and hastened the demise of several important railroads. Most notably, in 1968, regulators allowed the two largest railroads in the Northeast, the New York Central and its rival, the Pennsylvania Railroad, to combine. They formed the Penn Central. Less than 2 years later, in what was at the time the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history, the Penn Central collapsed. This threatened to leave the entire northeastern United States without rail service, an untenable economic catastrophe that would have sent ripple effects across industries and imperiled railroads throughout the country. So, while the Penn Central was put into receivership to keep it limping along, Congress responded first by relieving railroad corporations, not just in the Northeast, but across the country, of their obligation to carry passengers, abandoning a core duty and critical public benefit. This was a bailout and a windfall for the railroads who, except during World War II, lost money on their passenger service and subsidized it with their profits from freight. To take over that service and soften the blow, Congress and the Nixon administration created Amtrak, a publicly owned passenger railroad that many expected to fail. Despite passenger service having a history of being a cost to railroads, Congress burdened Amtrak with the unrealistic mandate for profit. And as we described in Episode 3, in an effort to live up to that mandate, the U.S. lost 50% of its passenger service overnight and much more in the subsequent years. But this sacrifice on the part of the public did not save the rail corporations, and especially those in the Northeast. So in order to protect the country from economic catastrophe, Congress reluctantly created Conrail, another publicly owned railroad corporation. Conrail took over the infrastructure and freight operations of the Penn Central and the other bankrupt Northeast railroads. The creation of Amtrak and the creation of Conrail were critical interventions to shield the country from the effects of an existential crisis within the U.S. rail system. The genesis of that crisis may very well have been the original decision to put private corporations in charge of stewarding this critical national infrastructure. So there is a cruel and stubborn irony that despite being made up of businesses that had gone bankrupt, Conrail, like Amtrak, was again given a mandate to generate a profit rather than to maintain service. To meet that mandate, Conrail was allowed to abandon thousands of miles of track. And even though billions of dollars in taxpayer money were invested to rehabilitate what remained of the system, Conrail continued to lose money at the same rate as the Penn Central had before it. This expectation of profit has been a constant in the history of U.S. railroading. But our stubborn refusal to question this fundamental assumption, even at that critical moment of crisis, reflects the broader situation in which policymakers found themselves at the time. Amidst the height of the Cold War, a combination of inflation and economic stagnation known as stagflation at home, and ever-present reverberations of Vietnam and Watergate, the support for a strong federal government that enabled the creation of the interstate highway system was eclipsed by a new ideological movement that would come to be known as neoliberalism. It was a tragic moment where circumstances conspired to prevent what was clearly necessary, a more profound reconsideration of our approach to rail transport. By the late 1970s, as officials clung dogmatically to their expectations of profitability, and as reality continued to rebuff and discredit those expectations, frustrations began to mount. It wasn't just that lawmakers saw Conrail's losses as an embarrassment, they also feared the precedent Conrail might set for other railroads and other struggling industries, legitimizing calls for full nationalization of the U.S. rail system. But they were hemmed in. As long as Conrail was losing money, reprivatization was inconceivable. And the alternative, once again, was a massive loss of rail service in the region, an outcome for which no politician was ready to be held accountable. So instead, they turned to deregulation, a series of legislative and policy measures, culminating in 1980, reoriented the purpose of U.S. rail policy, shifting the emphasis from the public's access to service toward ensuring the commercial viability of railroad corporations at any cost. Instead of protecting and preserving what had been a vital circulatory system for our society, the stage was set for the U.S. rail system to be pruned and repurposed into a superhighway for globalization. This episode tells the story of how that transformation took place, who benefited and who got left behind, and how this dovetailed with broader changes in the U.S. and global economies to shape the world that we are living in today. I'm Bill Moyer, and this is Reconnect America, a podcast about how rail transport and the corridors trains operate on offer potential solutions to some of the most vexing problems of our time.
Railroads lost their presence in a lot of places. They pulled people out of offices that used to be division offices in medium-sized cities, and these places became ghost towns.
We saw reorientation of the public purpose of railroads away from serving Americans and the heartland of America towards just, hey, can we bring a box from the port of LA to Chicago?
Globalization really took off There was this big country we needed to get across, principally from Los Angeles and Long Beach to Chicago, and trains were perfect for that.
They looked at it from a big view at 30,000 feet, looking down on all these systems and said, why do we need two routes across the Midwest? Let's get rid of this higher cost one. We'll just vacuum them up and shut them down.
1980, we had about 40 Class 1 railroads. Today we have 6, and that period from 1980 to the early 2000s, we saw a consolidation of many of the systems together to just a few remaining systems.
Things really went downhill as they became more and more monopolized. That helped embolden railroad management to just realize we don't have to treat our customers very well anymore.
To fully grasp just how profoundly deregulation upended the way the U.S. approached rail transport, let's briefly recall how the previous regulatory regime worked. As we've discussed in previous episodes, the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 created the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC, to protect shippers from the monopoly power of the railroads in remote areas and to protect railroads from ruinous competition with each other. The way the ICC did this was by setting upper and lower limits on the rates that railroads could charge their customers.
One of the big parts of the Interstate Commerce Act and subsequent legislation was that the ICC had the ability to adjudicate what a fair transportation rate was.
That's Arnav Rao, transportation policy analyst at the Open Markets Institute.
They had the ability to say, no, you're overcharging customers here, or you're pricing so low that you're doing this to drive other competitors out of the business here. So they had the ability to adjudicate both high and low prices.
The Interstate Commerce Act also designated railroads as common carriers, meaning that whatever rate a railroad charged to move a given commodity, every shipper along its lines was, upon reasonable request, entitled to service at that published rate. As we covered in Episode 4, this system was designed to protect shippers' access to rail, regardless of where they were located or how much freight they needed to move. Railroads could not upcharge or turn away a customer merely because they were not as profitable as others. These regulations meant that railroads had much less room to compete on price, so they competed on the quality of their service. However, as railroad corporations began to collapse in the 1960s and 70s, the ICC's control over their rates came to be seen as part of the problem. It was claimed that regulation was keeping the price of service artificially high, at a cost to both consumers and to the railroads themselves, who were losing business to trucks as a result. That's where deregulation came in. It involved a string of interventions by Congress, as well as rule changes by the ICC itself. But the centerpiece was the Staggers Act of 1980.
Staggers led to the ICC almost fully abandoning its pricing and rate setting obligations. And it basically allowed railroads to now enter long-term shipper-specific contracts.
For the first time since the 1880s, shippers and railroads could negotiate rates without any floor or ceiling. The idea was that competition between railroads and from trucks would drive down rates below the level where the ICC had been keeping them. For some shippers, rates did go down, at least for a time, but many more were unable to enjoy the benefits of competition between railroads because they only had access to one. These are known as captive shippers, and although the captivity of many shippers to a single railroad was an old problem, the wave of consolidation that the industry underwent in the 1960s and 70s had only made things worse. To get a sense of the extent of railroad consolidation prior to the Staggers Act, consider this. The United States categorizes its railroads into 3 revenue tiers, with Class 1 railroads being the largest. In 1911, the U.S. had 177 Class 1 railroads. By 1980, there were only 33, and as we will see, another wave of mergers was already on the horizon. So, while the Staggers Act forced railroads to compete for some customers on both price and service quality, for others, They were given a kind of leverage that had been kept out of their reach for almost a century.
They were allowed to price discriminate between shippers, charging one price to one shipper and another price to another shipper, and providing different terms of service to different shippers.
For shippers who bore the brunt of this discrimination, things were made worse by the fact that their contracts with railroads were confidential. So shippers didn't know when they were getting a higher rate than their competitors, and therefore couldn't negotiate on the basis of that information. And if a customer couldn't meet the railroad's profit margin expectations, the railroad now had little to no obligation to provide the service at all. By raising rates beyond what a shipper could afford to pay, railroads could filter out the freight they didn't want to move, a practice known as demarketing. Now, there is an asterisk to this apparent impunity for railroads. When it came to the process of deregulating rates, the ICC did retain a modicum of discretion in how this played out. Rather than deregulating rates directly and across the board, the Staggers Act instructed the ICC to exempt railroads from regulations on a commodity-by-commodity basis. Whenever the Commission found that sufficient competition existed to prevent monopoly abuses for a given commodity type, it was required to carve out an exemption for the movement of that commodity. Crucially, however, it wasn't just railroad-to-railroad competition that counted. If a commodity could also be moved by truck, that was considered competition enough, and the ICC had to exempt it. The result was that anything that could be moved by truck got fully deregulated. The only commodities that remained subject to ICC oversight were those that cannot be practicably moved by truck over long distances, things like grain, coal, crude oil, and some hazardous chemicals. If shippers of these commodities wanted to enter contracts with railroads, the Staggers Act allowed them to do so, but they also retained the option of shipping under a published rate, known as a tariff. Though this vestige of protection for certain shippers was designed to prevent the worst monopoly abuses, in practice, it has amounted to almost nothing. In order for regulators to intervene, a shipper has to prove that a tariff rate is almost double what it costs the railroad to provide the service, and few, if any, shippers are in a position to do the modeling necessary to meet this burden of proof. The result was that no shipper actually retained the same level of regulatory protection they had enjoyed prior to the Staggers Act. On top of shifting to contracts and the erosion of common carrier obligations that this implied, railroads were given another tool for filtering out less profitable customers.
With the passage of Staggers, the process to abandon lines and spin off lines became essentially frictionless.
For most of the 20th century, the ICC had exercised tight control over the abandonment of existing rail lines. But with deregulation, that oversight practically disappeared. Between 1980 and 2000, the amount of track operated in the U.S. by Class I railroads fell from 165,000 miles to just 99,000 miles, a reduction of 40%. Of that, roughly 45,000 miles got spun off into hundreds of smaller, even less regulated railroads called short lines, fundamentally reshaping the structure of the U.S. railroad map.
The result was a radical transformation of what our freight railroad system looks like now. Class I railroads are now just serving as the super highways, and the local feeder collection is all done by the short lines, who are in large part still captive to the Class I railroads.
As we will see in an upcoming episode, commercial viability was anything but certain for these new short lines. They were taking over the very branch lines that the Class Is had been itching to get rid of, many with decades of deferred maintenance. These lines often had too little traffic to sustain a standalone railroad operation. In addition, Class I railroads often retained immense leverage to dictate the level of service that short lines could provide to their customers. When a short line shut down, or when no one could be found to buy or lease a line to begin with, and the line got abandoned, communities lost access to service and got left behind. As Arnav points out, it wasn't only Congress, but also the ICC itself that was responsible for this outcome.
The craze and the scale of the spin-offs and abandonments was really driven by the ICC's lax interpretation of what the statutory language actually was.
However, this reorientation in the ICC's approach to regulating railroads didn't originate within the Commission. It was downstream of a broader shift in economic thinking that affected not just the laws that Congress gave the ICC to implement, but also who got appointed to the job.
The ICC, throughout its first 50 years, was a really revered institution. It was kind of held up as the perfect model of regulatory governance and fair-mindedness and balancing the various aspects of regulatory policy. But starting in post-1950s, 1960s, and into the 1970s, there really was this push from both sides for a broader deregulatory policy. In 1980, the Staggers Act was passed. It was a bipartisan push, and what we saw was that the members of the ICC were chosen by the administrations for their adherence to the deregulatory spirit.
Though proponents of this deregulatory spirit touted free market principles to justify their actions, the ultimate result was often an elimination of competition between railroads rather than a restoration of it. Nowhere was this more apparent than when it came to mergers and acquisitions.
The ICC, and especially the Reagan and the Bush ICCs, kind of abandoned any sense of real merger enforcement in the public interest.
Later on, we'll see just how far railroads were ultimately allowed to push the envelope with consolidation. But it's important to remember the context. This was not the first time that the ICC had adopted a permissive approach to mergers. In Episode 4, we saw how Congress and the ICC had already embraced consolidation twice before when things had gotten rocky for the railroads. And given the crises that had befallen railroads in the 1960s and 70s, the ICC was highly prone to being overprotective of the financial health of the railroad corporations.
One of the big spooks of the time, and I think one of the big drivers for deregulation, was the bankruptcy of the Penn Central. It's hard to overstate how much of an effect that had on the public at large and on Congress and on regulators. So one of the big focuses post-deregulation was a shift from public accountability focus to one where revenue adequacy was the primary goal for the railroads. And the ICC and the railroads were all saying at the time, how do we get the railroads to become revenue adequate? We have to consolidate. We'll be able to find efficiencies in our infrastructure, and we'll be able to reduce the number of workers. And we have a bloated workforce and all of that. So I think the ICC took hook, line, and sinker the fact that revenue adequacy required further consolidation and the creation of national large rail systems. And to a degree, rail does demonstrate that large systems work well, but there is a stopping point to that. It can't just be a large system. It needs to be a large system that is governed in the public interest. And we abandoned both of those things at the same time. We allowed the systems to get large, and we abandoned the public interest part of regulation and instead focused on just, can we make these railroads revenue adequate?
So, these were the main pillars of deregulation. 1, a shift from common carriage to contract carriage that allowed railroads to give preferential treatment to larger customers, i.e. discriminate. 2, a massive pruning of Class 1 railroad branch lines through spin-offs and abandonments. And 3, an embrace of further consolidations that would leave the U.S. with just a small handful of mega railroads exerting ever greater market power over their customers. Each of these components dovetailed with the others to supplant the public purpose of this critical national infrastructure with the private purpose of maximizing the profits of railroad corporations at any cost. For the first 20 years after deregulation, rates did, on average, go down, and the amount of freight that railroads carried increased. But the benefit for shippers was not universal. There were clear winners and losers. To understand who they were and what caused them to bear the brunt of railroad deregulation, we need to take a closer look at how railroads adapted to this new environment. More specifically, we need to examine what kind of service these newly deregulated, combined, and slimmed down railroads were incentivized to provide, and how this fit in with broader transformations in the U.S. economy writ large.
We really saw a shift in the type of traffic that railroads were taking on. They wanted to shift away from carload manifest type service where we had to go in and sort these cars in a classification yard and a hump yard towards unit trains where we can just ship from A to B without having to reclassify it. And unit trains are really low cost for railroads, so that's where they saw the maximum potential to increase their margins.
For context, when Arnov says carload traffic, also known as merchandise or manifest traffic, he's referring to trains carrying many different kinds of cargo, headed for multiple destinations. In contrast to a manifest train, a unit train consists of a single commodity traveling from a single origin to a single destination. As Arnov points out, that's a lot cheaper for the railroad, and deregulation made it especially attractive. The more expansive railroad systems became through mergers, the greater the distances they could move unit trains without handing them off or interchanging with another railroad. In addition, by spinning off and abandoning tens of thousands of miles of less profitable branch line, railroads freed up a whole new pool of capital. And with the scaling back of regulations on rates, they could now use those resources to attract the unit train traffic they wanted by offering generous discounts. The problem was, unit trains had to be a certain length for railroads to agree to move them, and that length kept increasing, 26 cars, 52 cars, 100 cars, and many shippers were just too small to meet that threshold. So, with the increased emphasis on longer and longer unit trains, a whole slew of shippers got pushed aside, forced to move their freight longer distances by truck, shut down their operations, or get swallowed up by larger competitors.
What we saw was that railroads for manifest carload traffic ended up demarketing a lot of these folks, saying, hey, your margin just isn't high enough for us to serve you. It still might be marginally profitable, but it's just not profitable enough to meet our requirements. So the demarketing of merchandise traffic really hurt producers of things in America. What is merchandise traffic? What is carload traffic? It's the raw inputs that we need to drive industrial growth in America. Those are the types of things that move in carloads on trains. And the demarketing of that really hurt American industry.
While all this was happening, the United States was also loosening restrictions on global trade. With the worldwide adoption of standardized intermodal shipping containers that could travel on ships, trucks, and trains, a flood of containerized freight began arriving at U.S. ports. With this massive inflow of goods, the intermodal train came into being as a new variation on the unit train, one that only carried containers.
We saw a pretty big growth in intermodal throughout this time period, and the railroads kind of just became a conveyor belt for boxes coming in from China. We saw reorientation, again, of the public purpose of railroads away from serving America and Americans and the heartland of America towards just, hey, can we bring a box from the port of LA to Chicago or Memphis or St. Louis? And we're only going to serve the most profitable customers and the biggest corporations that are bringing in boxes from China, the Walmarts and Amazons of the world.
This reorientation of the U.S. rail system, from serving as a vital circulatory system for towns and cities everywhere to being a superhighway for globalization, did not happen without resistance from veterans within the railroad industry. See, while unit trains are much more efficient for railroads to move, they often contain the lowest value freight. So a shift away from carload traffic, besides being harmful to the public, more trucks on the highways, also came at a cost to railroads.
back then, a lot of people were saying, hey, let's not forget about the higher margin business. Let's move the vegetables. Let's move the paper. Let's move the things that people want to get from A to B in a couple of days instead of a couple of weeks. And that's one thing that kind of depresses me, because I think they took the easy way out.
That's my friend and office neighbor, Ken Kirschling of Railstar Engineering. He started working in the railroad industry just as it was being deregulated, and he's been working there ever since.
It was harder to run railroads at higher speeds, better service. You needed more power. You needed more crews. It was easier to move the stuff that didn't complain, and you could take a month to move from A to B instead of a few days. And that went hand in hand with the mergers of the class ones into these mega railroads. That all working together just meant less attention to most of the customers and remaining attention to just the few that moved a great deal of freight. Railroads lost their presence in a lot of places. They pulled people out of offices that used to be division offices in medium-sized cities, and these places became ghost towns. Yeah, the railroad still went through there, but nobody paid attention to the local paper mill or to the local strawberry grower or whatever it might be. And if there's nobody there to work closely with the customers, well, the trucks are always there. Those people, they can shake their hand. They're people that they know that if they give them a load, it's going to get where it's supposed to go. That trucker will break all the rules in the books to get that load there for him. With the railroad, it was much less personal than it used to be. It used to be a very family thing in a sense that there were enough people that worked around the railroads that they had a local presence, they had a face, that they were part of the community. They even would back baseball teams and stuff. But all that went away as the big railroads looked at decreasing costs, the low-cost carrier.
We've been referring to the wave of consolidation that took place after 1980, and we'll see in a minute just how extreme that got. But first, it's worth zooming in on what consolidation actually looked like and the effects it had on the service that communities had depended upon for generations. Recall that because ICC regulation had largely prevented railroads from competing with each other on their rates, railroads had always competed on the quality of their service. According to Ken, this continued to be the case even after deregulation, as long as there remained enough railroads for competition to actually exist.
Railroads in the 80s, even though it was post-Staggers, were still competing for service. There were a lot of railroads left that paralleled other railroads, and so service still mattered. A good example was the Denver and Rio Grande partnering with the Missouri Pacific on one end and the Western Pacific on the other end to move freight back and forth between California and the West Coast and through the Kansas City and St. Louis gateways. And because the Union Pacific wasn't too far north of them, the Union Pacific also moved a lot of freight the same regions of the country. So these were competitors, and they ran fast trains, and they hustled their freight.
As railroads continued to merge in the 1980s and 90s, competition disappeared, and the quality of service declined. In addition, mergers often created a perceived network redundancy for railroad corporations. For their long-distance unit train and intermodal traffic, the endpoints of a route were all that really mattered, not the towns they passed through along the way. So when mergers gave one railroad control over parallel routes with shared endpoints, the railroad usually abandoned the line that was less profitable to operate. And that's exactly what happened with the competing lines that Ken was just describing.
The Union Pacific ended up owning all those railroads. And so now what used to be the Missouri Pacific across southern Colorado, southern Kansas, northern Oklahoma, that's freaking short line now. The Union Pacific had no interest in having parallel routes, even though each one of those routes generated a lot of their own traffic, but they looked at this large volume of traffic moving from the eastern United States to the western United States. And they looked at the Rio Grande, Southern Pacific, Western Pacific, and Missouri Pacific as a higher cost route to do the same thing. So what's really unfortunate is they threw the baby out with the bathwater. Even though those lines went through communities that the Union Pacific didn't go through, they still thought in bigger terms than that. They weren't out on the ground railroading with the local superintendents and train masters that were moving the traffic locally and were paying attention to the local customers. They looked at it from a big view at 30,000 feet, looking down on all these systems and said, why do we need two routes across the Midwest? Let's get rid of this higher cost one. We'll just vacuum them up and shut them down.
One of the mergers that Ken is referring to here is Union Pacific's acquisition of the Southern Pacific in 1996. When this merger was implemented, it impacted service in yet another way, illustrating another of the major risks that large railroad mergers create.
The Union Pacific experienced a systematic meltdown. Trains were literally lost in the systems, tracks were blocked for hundreds of miles, and the economy really suffered at that time. And the SP was kind of seen as this railroad at the time that was very poorly managed, and management was incompetent and they didn't know what they were doing. And so the UP kind of took a very blasé attitude of course we can manage the system better than the SP when we integrated. And that didn't end up happening. It had a huge meltdown for a very, very long time.
One might think that this would have instilled caution in regulators who are responsible for approving or rejecting merger proposals. But just a few years later, there was another service meltdown after a major merger. This one involved Conrail, the giant government-owned Northeastern Railroad that Congress created after the Penn Central bankruptcy in the 70s. Earlier, we mentioned that the failure of this taxpayer-financed railroad to make a profit was a key driver of deregulation. In fact, Conrail's own leadership lobbied for the Staggers Act, and once it was passed, they were quick to take advantage of it, making shrewd use of their pricing flexibility and abandoning thousands more miles of track. A few years later, Conrail wasn't just profitable, it had a net income in the hundreds of millions. But now that the government had successfully restored the commercial viability of the Northeastern Rail network, albeit at the expense of service, lawmakers, urged on by the Reagan administration, decided it was time to get rid of it. In 1987, Conrail was sold on the stock market in what was, at the time, the largest initial public offering in U.S. history and the largest sale of government property. 12 years later, in 1999, Conrail was split in half. Each half was absorbed by one of the two remaining Class I railroads east of the Mississippi, Norfolk Southern and CSX. It was a double merger that broke up Conrail's monopoly and turned it into a northeastern duopoly. As far as shippers were concerned, this might have been marginally better for competition in the region, but it also took yet one more railroad off the map, creating the megasystems that Norfolk Southern and CSX operate today, and leaving the country with just 7 Class I railroads. Ron Kamenko, co-founder and trustee of Railroad Workers United, was working for Conrail at the time, and he witnessed firsthand the meltdown that ensued.
On the Norfolk Southern side, which is where I happen to work, on day one, we experienced a severe shock wave. The computer systems did not combine and work properly together. I don't really understand how that happened, but they lost every car in the system, and it took about 18 months to recover. The railroad was completely constipated on the west end into Chicago, where our 2-track main line, which was a very, very modern and relatively sophisticated main line in terms of signaling and crossovers and ability to move on either track in either direction at any time, may have had anywhere from 5 to 10 trains that were tied down and parked between Elkhart and Chicago every day. And it was not uncommon to work 12 hours plus every day for days and days and days, weeks at a time. My personal record was I moved a train from Colauer Yard at milepost 510 to the bridge at CP 509. That's a grand total of 1 mile. I did that with my conductor in a 12-hour tour of duty. This is how backed up the railroad was. And so with these sort of inefficiencies, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of carloads were driven off the Norfolk Southern. I assume some went to CSX, others that could went to truck, and maybe some firms actually went out of business.
By this point in 1999, only 2 major railroads remained in any given region of the country, and most shippers only had access to one. In essence, the U.S. now had a handful of regional duopolies, each of which looked more like a monopoly the more you zoomed in. This situation was a far cry from the free market that proponents of deregulation had sought to unleash. All the more reason, from the railroad's point of view, to keep merging. The only question was whether the Surface Transportation Board, or the STB, which replaced the ICC in 1995, would keep rolling over for the railroads, or if regulators had finally seen enough.
In late 1999, BNSF and the CN announced that they wanted to merge. And the STB at this point, this was kind of like the tripwire to them. If BN and CN were allowed to merge, we would have this massive transcontinental giant forcing the remaining Class 1s into a final frantic round of defensive mergers. And in the STB's decision announcing this merger moratorium, they contemplate the fact that, hey, if we had allowed that merger to go through, we would have been left with only 2 transcontinental duopolies. And the STB finally admitted that the market couldn't handle this level of concentration without a total collapse of what remained of the common carrier system. And so in March 2000, the STB took the step of imposing a 15-month merger moratorium on all rail mergers. And during that time, the board claimed that it needed time to rewrite the rules because the old ones from the 1980s were inadequate to protect the public interest. And we wanted to ensure that this final round of consolidation, if it ever happened, would actually be in the public interest. And so as a result of all the service meltdowns that had happened in the decade prior, for the first time, the government finally said no and rewrote the merger rules to say that we need to enhance competition if there ever is a new merger.
In conjunction with its rule change requiring any future merger to increase competition between railroads, the STB also granted an exemption from these rules to the smallest Class 1 railroad, Kansas City Southern. In 2023, Kansas City Southern did merge with Canadian Pacific, one of the 2 major Canadian railroads with networks extending into the U.S. The combined railroad is called Canadian Pacific Kansas City, or CPKC, and yes, this merger did, predictably, result in a severe service disruption. Aside from the CPKC merger, however, the balance of powers between railroads actually held firm, and could continue to do so, with no other Class 1 mergers thus far being approved. But while this 20-year pause on consolidation may have averted or at least delayed some amount of harm to the public, much of the damage had already been done. As we've seen, the declining rates that shippers enjoyed in the first 20 years after deregulation were largely paid for by the enormous cost savings that railroads derived from mergers, abandonments, and the demarketing of less profitable freight to focus on heavy unit trains moving long distances. But by the early 2000s, with spin-offs and abandonments nearing their natural limit and further consolidation all but taken off the table, railroad managers now had to make a choice. Would they find new ways to grow their business by attracting less profitable customers they had been turning away for 20 years? Or would they stop growing, pull up their investments, and simply squeeze more profit out of the customers they already had? With the immense market power they now held over shippers, and a regulatory board which was still showing little interest in stepping in to protect the public, you can probably guess what the railroads chose to do.
2004, you start to see a change in the approach to the railroads from a growth mindset to a profitability one. So you really start to see rail rates grow much more quickly post-2004 than you see pre-2004.
What Wall Street saw was a really vital sector, a monopoly sector. It's lightly regulated. There's very little risk there. So it's an easy target for the financial sector.
Everyone wants to see an increase in quarterly profit. Nobody wants to wait 12 quarters. That's what leads you to seeing a rail industry where they spend 3 times as much on buybacks and dividends for shareholders as they do on maintenance and expansion.
We pulled a whole bunch of capital out of the system. And what it means is there's much less tolerance for error. And so when something goes wrong, it's a cascade.
It's doing less with less. Really, it's just making things more efficient for the railroad. It didn't really result in making things better for the shippers.
There's lots of things that the rail industry could do to bring back more traffic. There's a problem, though. All of that costs money. Wall Street doesn't want that. So what's the solution? Merge.
You don't need a merger to compete with trucking. And if they merge, they would still not compete with trucking.
If this merger is allowed, 47% of the freight will be controlled by one railroad, the only transcontinental route by one railroad.
How does it enhance competition if you're eliminating one entire railroad?
As much harm as deregulation caused to shippers and communities who got left behind, this much remained true for the first 20 years. Rates on average declined, the amount of freight that railroads carried increased, and railroad finances recovered beyond any question of long-term stability. But the costs the public would ultimately pay for this recovery were still to be seen. With the consolidation of the industry from 33 Class I railroads in 1980 to just 7 in 2000, there arrived from Wall Street an aggressive class of predatory investors who saw an opportunity to squeeze yet unseen levels of profit out of shippers, consumers, and the infrastructure that the nation's economy depends upon. These activist investors would look at railroads not as a business to be grown, but as a resource to be mined. As their takeovers unfolded, standards of service, community safety, and the resilience of the system would be cast aside as irrelevant. Rates would sharply rise and volumes stagnate, moving more and more freight to trucks. Hundreds of billions of dollars would be siphoned out of the system through stock buybacks and dividends. In the years to come, this cynical profiteering would spill over into the public's awareness in the form of service meltdowns, catastrophic derailments, and the widespread discontent of workers and shippers alike. Railroad executives would come under fire from regulators, and both would face scrutiny from Congress, shippers, and the public. The few managers that dared to prioritize long-term growth over short-term profit would become targets of activist investors like Ancora that leverage a tiny amount of stock to take over boards and replace CEOs. Finally, Wall Street's railroads would once again take up the cause of consolidation, threatening to trigger an endgame moment in the long-standing struggle between the public purpose of this critical national infrastructure and the private interests that control it. That's for next time on Reconnect America. Reconnect America is a podcast by Solutionary Rail. This episode was written by Sasha Alenko and me, Bill Moyer. Audio engineering by Tom Stiles and August Moore. Occasional percussion by yours truly, and background music by my old bandmates in Oda Proda. Special thanks to Ken Jacobson for our theme music. You can find this show on Substack, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You may have noticed that this podcast doesn't have ads or a paywall. With your help, we can keep it that way. Pitch in and get involved by visiting solutionaryrail.org. We're not here to sell you anything. We're here to build a movement.